How you guys doing? Today I'm going to talk a little bit about valve train wear. Um, with bigger camshafts, what is what's happening? Sometimes I get calls, guys complaining or wondering about the durability of larger camshafts, what it's going to do with the valve train, and ultimately, valve train wear ends up being the most maintenance involved issue, or that will require the most maintenance as we make more horsepower. It seems rotating assemblies are fine. Valve train is always gonna be the issue, as with most engines. So with when we go bigger on camshaft, you're lifting the valve substantially more and holding it open for a longer duration, which means you're holding it open for a longer period of time. In doing so, you need to increase valve pressure, seat and nose pressure. So this in general, most people will say, okay, I buy a certain spring kit that's available. Most go to the Kibblewhite spring kit, which is widely available on the market through pretty much any retailer that's dealing from a big parts wholesaler. So that's the common kit, and that spring kit does work fine. It is rated at 480 lift. Most of the bigger camshafts on the market are 500. If installed and checked properly, it will run 500 lift camshafts. But here's where you come into a few different things. Is you can max out a spring kit in a few different ways. You can max it out on lift, where it coil binds, where basically you no longer have room for that coil spring to move, and the spring itself binds because it runs out of travel. You can run out on RPM, where the spring is not designed for a certain RPM, and you can run out on weight, where the spring is not capable of supporting a certain valve weight. So this is where the problem comes in with springs and cams on the market. Is a +1 valve, +1 millimeter larger than stock, and a +2 millimeter larger than stock, and going up from there have substantial weight increases. So a setup, a cam that's working on a certain spring kit on a +1 valve may not work on a +2 valve. It may float the valve, and what that term means that the valve is no longer in control, where the spring can no longer effectively control that valve, either at that lift or at RPM. Pretty much it's RPM limited where you'll see the failure. So sometimes that valve float is above the RPM range that you're using, as well as it could be over the rev limiter as well. So basically in valve size and valve weight, that changes what spring kit you need to use. So on our +2 heads, we use a different spring kit than we use on our +1 heads, even though they see the same RPM and the same camshaft lift. So like in the +1 heads, they're not seeing as much duration, and that valve size is smaller with less weight, so that valve can maintain under control. In the +2 heads, you see a larger valve, so you get an increase in weight. You also get increase of airflow behind the valve, so the surface area of the valve is larger, which has more area it's covering, which has more resistance to change in direction. If you kind of figure it's a small change, but if you kind of figure a sail, if you have a sail that's 20% bigger than the one before it, it's going to have more push, more wind resistance. So that does come into effect. It's not really a big issue, but that does happen, and especially on turbocharged engines that have a pressure behind that valve, you end up having to go up in spring pressure to accommodate for the boost pressure. So that is important. Another thing with the +2 heads is normally running a little bit bigger duration camshaft, so that spring needs to be able to recover to handle that additional duration. So on setting up heads, another thing that's important is if somebody's ordering a camshaft and a spring kit, they can buy those parts that work together. They can buy the same parts that we use in our cylinder heads. I can sell them those parts, or maybe they get them from somewhere else, or something very similar. But if the valve job is not cut in the same fashion or the same style, if the valve job is cut deeper and the install height of the spring, basically when the spring's in the head, the measurement of how long that valve is when it's installed, if that's not correct or to spec, if that adjustment is not made, then the valve spring will no longer support the valve efficiently. So that is another common issue. Guys will buy parts, put it together, say, oh, I'm having this certain issue. It's floating the valve, or it's not, it's wearing the valve job out, something of that sort. And I ask them, well, what's the install height on the spring kit? And they say, well, I just put it in. So that really depends on who's making that final installation to make that adjustment. There is shims available to go with each spring kit, and that is a necessity to do. So besides that, the next thing is valve guide. Guys having issues with wearing valves out prematurely need to check the valve guide for wear, and also the length of the valve guide. So a lot of guys porting heads will cut the valve guide back substantially, or they have a high roof in their port. And as they're porting that head, removing length of guide, you lose some of the stability of the valve in the same time, because the guide is shortened, and any the guide to valve clearance in a short valve is more detrimental than in a long valve guide. So if you have a long valve guide that's a little bit loose, it's not going to be as big of a deal as a short guide that's a little bit loose, because that valve can move back and forth substantially more. So that is something to pay attention to. That's another reason why all of our heads we do are all built to order, ported to order, depending on what the application, what the intended use is. Somebody running a trail bike that's going to see low to mid RPM operation most of its life is not going to go through Valvetrain components as fast as a bike that's used out on the say on the highway, or in a desert in a sustained high RPM range. And that kind of goes with racing as well. The bigger the camshaft, you're gonna need certain things to support that Valvetrain so it lives. So there's a lot more that goes into it than just buying parts and putting it together. There's a lot of factors that come into play. Same thing with the valve job itself, with the seats, whether how far you push a seat, if you want to put a bigger seat in the head for durability, if you want to put a bronze seat in there, or bronze guides to help heat transfer. A lot of things come into play besides just buying parts. So keep that in mind. It's best to always ask and give the most information that you have available to you to who you're buying the components from, as well as relay that information of what you're actually doing with the bike, not just, oh, I need a head, because that's not the case. That's going to suit you best. So I think that's all I have on Valvetrain. We've gone over a little bit of bush rocker arms and rocker arm modification and camshafts in past videos. There's a few other tricks we do in the head, and not going to get into porting right now, but in Valvetrain, durability and setup, there's a lot that goes into that besides cutting a +2 valve and throwing it in there. So that's kind of one of the last things I wanted to mention is some guys call us and say, can you just do a +2 valve job on this head? And my answer is no. Because there's a lot more that goes with that. What I've seen guys do is send a head, because I've taken apart motors and seen this, is guys will send a head to get a valve job on a stock head. They'll put +2 valves in it and then not do any porting. So this happens more than you think it would happen. They run terrible. I mean, just don't do it like that. It's kind of a waste of time. The porting needs to be done in conjunction with the valve job and setting up the head for everything to work. So we do repairs, we do refresh on heads to get them back running right. But as far as just putting valves in a head, that's not something we're into. There's other places that will do that and be fine with that. But that's it for today. If you got any thing you need to know on that, feel free to call, and we can discuss what's best suited for you. All right, thank you.